It's wonderful to be here. As I was just saying, when we were having our business meeting in the bathroom, that that it's absolutely wonderful to see the progress that has been made, and remarkable to see the progress that has been made from a vision literally 5 years ago when this was launched. So I want to thank everybody here and online. I'm Barbara Bierer. Am a Vivli co-founder, and that's probably the most important part of my role here today. It's delightful to welcome you back, but we do have a hard stop at 5 minutes of 12 because we have to buzz into the lunchroom to listen to Monica. Unfortunately, that will not be televised, or available to the virtual participants. So our job today is to talk about credit and incentivizing the academic culture. We've heard a lot about that this morning already, how hard it is for academic researchers, and the fact that industry has been actually proportionally, particularly, much more successful at sharing data. And the question is, how can we help investigators to be better data contributors who are academics? And we all know sort of some of the tensions. There's certainly funding, time. At the beginning of a project, you don't necessarily think about sharing at the end of that project, so it's not necessarily set up. We don't have teams available to us to be able to help us with organizing that, anonymizing the data, sharing it. At least there is a platform where we're able to do that. And then there are concerns not only about funding, but also about junior investigators, and this sense that if you open it up to the world, will we really be able to support secondary analyses, et cetera. So with that, we have three people who are going to be talking and giving us their perspective. We do have, as I said, a hard stop, so they were given the challenge of discussing one major barrier and specifically focusing on solutions. So with that, let me ask Elliott to begin. Elliott Antman, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. This is a very interesting discussion, and I want to begin by acknowledging the leadership of Vivli in pushing the envelope forward here to make this kind of effort possible. So I'm an academic investigator, and for over 40 years, I've been doing clinical trials in cardiovascular medicine. I do want to indicate to you another report that the National Academy of Medicine hosted, and this was published in 2019, and it's called Individual Patient-Level Data Sharing for Continuous Learning, a Strategy for Trial Data Sharing. And I was a co-author on that paper, and there are 5 opportunities that are mentioned in that report, and I'll spend most of my time on the 5th one. But I want to point out that the boundary for what I'm going to be discussing is, of course, individual patient data. And just to be absolutely clear, today, primary data generators are collaborating and sharing data. You know this. There are, for example, in the cardiovascular space, there's the Antiplatelet Trilist Consortium. There's right now the 4 major direct oral anticoagulants have shared their data into the combined database so that we can actually move the effort forward. But I would submit that what we're really talking about is potential use by secondary investigators.
Right.
And really what I want to talk about here is that interface between the primary data generators and the secondary data users, shall I say. I may not be using, the appropriate nomenclature here. So just quickly, some of those obstacles, which I believe still remain to some degree. The incentives for the primary researchers remain insufficient, particularly for the junior investigator who is putting in all that time, anticipating that they will have access to the data to write the secondary papers, because that's the currency of academia for them. And right now, that's how individuals get promoted in academic institutions. It's the papers they write, the impact factor of the journals in which they are published. And losing access to that, or potentially losing access to that, is an important problem for them. Consent and privacy issues have not been standardized, and I would submit that we do need to consider that if there is a mechanism for patients to withdraw their consent from their data being pooled, think of GDPR here, we increase the degrees of missingness in that data set, and that may not be random. That could be a problem. The operational expenses Dr. Bierer has alluded to. I want to emphasize the next one also, which is exactly what is shared. Dr. Loeb mentioned the aspirational goals put out in the original IOM report about the raw data and the statistical analysis plan and the analytic code. That's a very interesting one as well. But I'm going to spend the remainder of my remarks on the standards. Right now, we have standards for how to report a clinical trial, the consort diagram that we talk about in clinical trials. We have the PRISMA standard for meta-analyses. We have the STROBE standard for observational studies. We do not have a standard that we can all stand up and point to for how to share data. And in my conversations with Dr. Zhao over this past weekend at the American Heart Association meeting, I suggested that this was an enormous opportunity for the National Academy of Medicine to take a leadership role for that interagency collaboration that Dr. Califf talked about between, for example, the FDA, the NIH, and the CDC. We would need to have some mechanism for establishing the standards. And I think if we have that and people turn to that and we operate under standards that are put forward by an authoritative body, we will see more uptake of the principles that we're all espousing here for data sharing. We do need to think about the metrics for success. I loved what Dr. Lee showed us as the output from Vivli, but we need to think about what is the real goal of data sharing. And I would argue that improvement of health care and establishing the ways to do that through guidelines are the major goals that we would like to see. And hopefully, if we can put the standards together, we should see more of that. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Dan Ford.
Yeah, I'm Dan Ford. I've been at Johns Hopkins for most of my career.
Can you turn the mic on? Yeah,
That part.
and then
Okay,
speak
there we
into
go.
it.
Thanks.
Thank
All right, let me start again. So I'm Dan Ford, and I've been a clinical researcher at Johns Hopkins for most of my career. I was the vice dean for clinical investigation for 20 years until a couple years ago. I run a couple training grants and involved with the Trial Innovation Network for the CTSA. So I kind of see the scope and look at what young investigators, how they see this as this problem. So first of all, I think it's good we actually worked more on how you do a better job with clinicaltrials.gov and getting that implemented in the academic institution. The first thing you have to do is get the academic institution to agree it's their problem and not just the individual PIs. And almost all of the clinicaltrials.gov problems we have with reporting are faculty that left, faculty that have died, very sick, their data manager's gone. Those are the problems. And they can be, those are important data not to lose sometimes. So I think that is the first step that has to occur. The other one that we have noticed in clinicaltrials.gov that we've done papers on asking how many institutions, how much support do you give to clinicaltrials.gov in terms of making that real? And it's obviously there's variability. Some are still almost zero or a half. But the other thing you notice, and I hope this is true in data sharing, is that it takes more people in the beginning until you get the teams trained and understood and used to it and more of the infrastructure built up. Then, in fact, then it can maybe come down. So there's that implementation phase that takes more than the sustain phase. But so do young investigators, do they think that we should be doing data sharing? Yes. Is it their highest priority? No. And I think, if you look at the beginning of a study, right? Yes, I mean, the NIH requiring the data sharing plan has been important. It puts it in everybody's mind. But I was thinking too, clinicaltrials.gov has a little bit more meaning to them at the beginning because they know they're going to be judged on whatever primary and secondary outcomes they put in. You can kind of forget about data sharing in the beginning of a project, except for the issue of the consent. And that's where it throws in. And I think, to the extent that we had some national consent standards about data sharing in clinical trials, I think it would help a lot. It would, it would ease that transition, but it also would make it very clear at the beginning. And even, I can go on in other ways, but one of the things I think like an IRB policy is to say, data sharing has to be mentioned in each consent. We're not even saying it has to be one way or another, but it has to be addressed. It has to be there, and that would focus it a little bit. The other aspect, I do think we still need to think about this tension between the data generators and the data users. It's real. And I was reflecting during this meeting too that, we're very focused on team science, building research teams. If you look at what it takes to get a clinical trial funded now with stakeholder groups and patient advisory groups and bringing in the sites, all of that. And then I thought, well, when people have asked me to share data, it's pretty much a request that comes out of the blue, which is usually, can you give me more data? How did you really break down this category? Is there more data you can use? I don't even know that the meta-analysis is done until I happen to see it in the publication, right? There's no concept of a team that says, gee, we're using your data. Maybe you want to make a comment before we publish it, or maybe you want to join us. It really seems totally not team oriented at all. You seem like you're being used for much of it. We all know there's a reason to do it. And I think, to me, most of the time it's focusing on the better understanding of subgroups. Because everybody, when they're designing their study, they're being asked, how can you look at subgroups? How would you look at, and they all see the power problem, and they all would like, we all would like to be able to answer those questions. So when I talk about data sharing in the beginning, it's developing this approach that says, this is how we're going to really understand subgroups. That's good for you. It's good for the field. It's good for everybody. And I would go back to a little bit that we've done some of these about sort of these bringing clinical trials together in the beginning, the pre-planned meta-analysis, slightly different interventions, same outcomes. This creates a really very team-based sharing of data that I think is what we would all like to eventually get to. But sometimes you do that. And then I'll just say one last thing. We really pushed it in the COVID era. In terms of the Trial Innovation Network, where we were trying to get DSMBs to share data while the trials were ongoing. We definitely had a pushback from PIs about what that meant. We were probably 75% of the way to get there because the rationale for it was so clear. But again, if you have just got your clinical trial funded, a DSMB comes in, looks at similar trials and say, we're shutting down your trial based on other data, meta-analysis, and now you start over. That's not a very appealing approach. And it does reflect the way we set up universities and funding.
Thank you.
I'll stop there.
Thank you. Ben.
Hi, thanks. This is exciting. I wish we had more time. Ben Pearson, work for the Gates Foundation. You can think of part of my role as helping make sure that the data we fund actually is pre-positioned to be shared in the right way and executing those kind of data sharing policies. But I want to step back and say, why are we doing this in the first place and why do we care? Because that's kind of an issue every funder has to grapple with, and they're always different. For us, our mission is to get to zero. Zero HIV, zero malaria, etc. Zero difference between a rich kid and a poor kid in health outcomes, poverty, getting out of poverty, and educational attainment. We are in the zone of highly granular data, subject level data, because it's about people and it's about ending things. And the closer you get to the end, the higher the marginal cost of any intervention. And you got to be precise and you got to be specific. So data has a unique value for us, and reuse of data has a unique value. And the reason that it has unique value is these three use cases that we kind of anchor to now. One is our own decision making. We are an investor, and we have to make high ROI or appropriate ROI decisions on what we fund, what interventions. And the sooner we can get data back about what's going on, and the sooner we can reanalyze it, the better the next investment is. If you wait for an 8-year trial to complete and get published and get the data underlying that, you've just spent 8 years of poor, dumb money going out the door, right? So it's got to be faster. The other issue is broad-based evidence. And broad access to evidence. And that drives policy, it drives programs, it drives regulatory approvals, it drives a lot of those interventions being developed and accepted and adopted in the areas we care about. And the third one is powering innovation. And this one has lagged behind a bit. Those digital tools coming online, that was a little bit clearer, but with the advent of AI, tools and large language models in particular, the demand for data is increasing dramatically, and we're seeing the pain points on inappropriate licenses for that purpose. And the data is not developed, especially when we're hunting for data to power contextually relevant LLMs in the geographies and languages that we care about. So that's great aspirationally. How do you execute on it? Well, tenure, I love the tenure theme. 8 years ago, because we're coming up on 2025, which would be the 10-year anniversary of our open access policy launching. So we did that. 2015, open access policy, transformative. It didn't actually get implemented that great. And it was focused on publications, comma, and all underlying data. And when you actually do the audit of it and take a random sampling, less than 1% of our funded peer-reviewed research actually was able to be, the data underlying it was actually able to be collected and reused. That's not great. So we, in fact, tried to do it ourselves when we wanted to figure out what causes stunting and wasting in kids. And you don't actually, look at stunting and wasting trials. You look at trials that measure kids' growth and mom's health. And you got to aggregate all that stuff. Well, we spent $500 million on that. We got 5% of the data back, right? When it came time to reanalyze it. And we eventually did get it back, but that's just because of who we are and leverage. And it didn't make a lot of people happy, frankly, but we got the answers. And I'd be happy to talk about that some other time. COVID, I'm glad you brought up COVID. In our business, speed matters. And COVID helps set a bar for speed. And we tried to do all the things that we learned we weren't doing so well. And you got to be early. You got to catch it during the grant making process. You can't expect to go get the data after the fact. You can't expect it to be developed as an asset for impact that meets all these great use cases that I just outlined. So we built in data management and sharing plans. We learned a lot from some of the things that Wellcome Trust was doing, some of the things that NIH had done, and we had to be really specific, right? What metadata? Where are you registering your trial? And provide guidance, because frankly, a lot of the academic trialists weren't ready to actually say where the data was going to live to meet these standards. And that's where organizations like Vivli came in really handy. And it's hard for us, and it was a big pivot for us, to think about them as grantee services versus infrastructure investments. And that's a big shift. Because when you think about it as grantee services, all of a sudden you're putting your core, go-to-market partner right at front and center in the grantees. And anything you do to help them is a good thing. I think some of the challenges that we're going to be wrestling with going forward is how do you actually operationalize that? How do you operationalize it consistently? We don't do well with carrots and sticks. We don't do well with sticks. We do it with carrots, right? It's money, right? And the more you can attach these efforts to money, the better you are from a funder perspective. In COVID, and just to tie a bow on that one, we were catching grants as they were going out the door and getting them before the funding was complete and putting management sharing plans as a funded milestone, 2-week payment milestone. And if the use case, and being specific about the use case, where does this data need to go? Do we need it for ROI decision making? Do we need it pooled for reanalysis during the pandemic? And the answer to the second one was yes. So that had to actually get data sharing agreements in place as a 4-week payment milestone, right? Otherwise, you're left with signing a data sharing agreement, a bilateral agreement with somebody that takes years to knock that out. But when you put it on a 4-week payment milestone, the lawyers snap into mode and they get it done. And just to emphasize that a little bit more, some of our exemplar grantees, data was flowing to Gates Medical Research Institute in partnership with the WHO 7 days after primary completion date. And data landed in Vivli 14 months after the grant agreement was signed. That's the speed bar that we want to hit every time. That's hopefully our new baseline. There are a lot of challenges we have to address going forward. Privacy's a big one. Global privacy regimes, exiting privacy law through synthetic data, de-identification, that's a big area of interest. Another one would be equity. I'm glad you said your data, right? Whose data? Is it the grantees' data, especially Northern grantees that are conducting trials in low and middle income countries with subawardees that are also associated with academic institutions? I think those are things we have to wrestle with. Is the data going to flow from Africa back to America and then off to somewhere else for reanalysis, or is it going to stay in Africa? So I think our challenge is going to be operationalizing from a funder perspective and doing so in a way that really comports with privacy law and what's needed from an equity perspective. And I will just say one last data point is really binary. It's been really interesting to watch the NIH roll out and implement their own policy. And that was something we paid a lot of attention to. How are they going to do this? Right? A lot of shoulds in there, a lot of may, right? And honestly, it's been almost a year and we haven't talked, right? We haven't shared best practices. And so I think that's something that has to change from a funder perspective. We talked a lot about interoperability and standardization, everything like that. I think funders need to start collaborating and figuring out what they're asking and how to make it happen around more than just the 3 use cases that we have.
Thank you. I mean, there are a couple of things that folks brought up while you're all thinking of questions that I want to just double down on. One is this issue of standardization. If we had standardization, it makes the funder conversation easier. And we should have the expectation that data dictionaries, the protocol, et cetera, are shared. The metadata is shared with the IPD. I think the consent issue is real, but I have to say, at least in the Vivli model where the data is not brought down from the data enclave, the privacy issue is somewhat less than in an open data model. I do think that one of the things we didn't touch on is that the data scientists are often different than the clinical investigators. And so, if you talk to the data scientists, they want all the data freely available all the time. You talk to the clinicians and they sort of, take the position that the two of you seem to take, which is, whoa, wait a second. There are a lot of issues we got to think about. Can we just go back to clinicaltrials.gov and just rest assured that we're putting in data? We actually did an analysis of this element 22, which says, are you going to share your data? And the answer was often yes. And when you looked at actually what they were going to share, they're going to share it with their research team. They don't even understand, what we're talking about when we say data sharing. So there's a lot of education to do. Mm-hmm. But, Ben, you said that carrots and sticks don't work. Funding is a huge carrot or a huge stick, depending on how you want to think about it. And if we got tougher, people would think about it at day 0 before they've put their trial together and would think about organizing the data in a way that is then shareable. And I think without sort of motivating the academic community, it's going to be very hard. And I also think that, we should, as a community, be speaking to our academic leadership that first and last author, co-first, co-last, whatever, is no longer okay, given the sort of growth of team science. We're not in a 1990s model anymore, and all of our junior investigators have the advantage that they're able to have the data and really understand the data if they're going to be analyzing it within that data set. So why don't we sort of challenge each other, even through the CTSA? And I'm looking forward to, haranguing Monica in a few minutes. Why don't we make that, sort of an expectation?
Well, I mean, I can say one thing. If you talk about the NIH enforcement and not funding, if it's a huge difference if an individual investigator thinks they won't get funded, they'll say, I may not do another clinical trial. But when you say, if you don't report, the institution doesn't get funding, and all the other faculty researchers are going to be at loss because of their behavior, that changes it. That gives them, and that's the motivation. But you have to have the people, the professionals that are there to support them to do that. And, that's been very helpful at Johns Hopkins out of our, library data science, is to have 2 to 3 people that are ready to help answer those questions, the technical questions. I don't know if it's a good idea. I probably want to do it, but help me figure out, what is a good repository? What is how close am I to anonymizing data? How can I put access to it? If that combination works, but it takes 5 or 10 years. That's what it took. How long for clinicaltrials.gov?
Yeah, and Ben.
Can I respond to that? So first, if I mischaracterized carrots and sticks, we didn't do sticks, and now you just gave me the language and the approach for the best stick. I think we're getting closer to being ready for it, because data sharing was like the 5th most important thing. So you're not going to stop working with a grantee just because we're not going to do that. That's too hard. It's becoming more of the 2nd most important thing now. And so that institutional comment's great. I'm taking it back with me. And the make it, it was possible, but it was too hard. So making it easy is really important. And that was one of the things we got out of COVID, was that in that experience, people say, well, I'll just put it in my universities in the library. In the library, I'll manage it. And then we say, well, does it meet these requirements? No, it doesn't. Where do I do that? And then all of a sudden it was like, well, here's a list of institution repositories that can do that and can facilitate data sharing. And, Vivli was surely on that list. And then it was just a matter of choosing from that list and negotiating directly with Vivli rather than us. Then we're not in the middle of it, right? It's more of that. That's what I meant by the services, is that's just a field service, and you work it out with that repository to meet those requirements.
And I'll get to, but Gates and others have been very good about funding some of the expenses, for instance, of anonymization and for setting this up. That is something we need to figure out more universally.
Yes.
Elliott?
Yes. Barbara, I want to mention something that I've noticed over the last several years, and has to do with the kinds of analyses that are conducted. And I want to give a very simple, and I apologize for the simplicity of this analogy. If I gave you a Texas Instrument calculator and I asked you to calculate 2 + 2, you're going to get 4. And if I gave you a Hewlett-Packard calculator, you're going to use 2 + 2 and get 4. So that's duplication. That's not replication. And I'm defining replication here as by the individual who's taking the original data set and generating their own statistical analysis plan so that they can actually test the questions that they're hoping to explore in that data set. And I would argue that I've had the same experience where my phone suddenly rings and somebody's calling, had nothing to do with the original data set, and is asking technical questions. I'll give you an example of a technical question. So if you're on a medication and you need to have a procedure, let's say that medication is an anticoagulant, and you come off the anticoagulant to have your colonoscopy, and you have a bleeding episode N number of days after your colonoscopy. So you're in the denominator while you're taking the drug. You're off the denominator and not at risk when you're off it. But for how long are you off out of the denominator? And when do you get put back in the denominator? It has to do with the half-life of the drug. So these are all very important questions, and it may take several years with multiple teams of biostatisticians trying to establish that. If we're truly going to move the field forward and other individuals have other ways of approaching the analysis, I think they actually have to generate that statistical analysis plan themselves. I would argue that one of the things that needs to be asked is, do you have the infrastructural support as a potential secondary data user to understand the data set and actually conduct the analysis so we don't create what no one here wants, which is an error, which leads to misinformation, out in the clinical community. I've seen some examples where there's the potential error in small data sets, and I haven't seen anything that has adversely affected clinical care, but we do need to be vigilant to make sure that that kind of event does not occur.
Thank you.